So it is time for my least favorite books of the year video. In case you're new to this channel, every year I dedicate the month of December to rereading my favorite books. I do this because I love rereading and also because it takes a lot of pressure off of me for these end of the year videos. I can get them out in a timely manner and not really worry about maybe one book slipping in at the end that deserves to be on one of these lists. I know it won't because I've already read all these books. So thankfully, because I'm very comfortable with DNFing or did not finish a book, this list isn't going to be super long. Any book that I wasn't enjoying throughout the year, I just quit. I have a whole video, all the books I DNF'd in 2019. I'll link it right there as well as down in the description if you want to know about those books. So this list, what I'm going to do is I'm going to very quickly get through the books that just kind of let me down. I hoped I would love them a lot more than I did, but unfortunately it didn't work out for me. These ended up being 2-star books, which is just like the 3-star is the middle of the rating scale. That's an average middle of the road book. A 2-star is a little bit below that. It was a bummer. It let me down, but it's not the worst thing in the world. So I'm going to quickly get through those books, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time ranting about the one book that got 1 star this year. It was a bummer. So very quickly, the books that just kind of bummed me out, just let me down, we're going to start with the doozy, Nevernight. Nevernight is a well-loved book, so I get that people love it. But every book isn't going to work for every person. It did not work for me. First of all, and the most simple reason that it didn't work for me is that assassin training school books just aren't my jam. If I'm going to follow an assassin, I want to follow an assassin. I don't want to follow an assassin in school, taking classes, being threatened by teachers. I've read a few of these types of books. They all kind of look the same to me, and I just don't really get the tension of it. That said, Jay Kristoff's writing style, shoo, don't like it. I don't like the footnote structure. I find it very jarring. You'll be in the middle of action and then you'll get a half-page long narrative about something that simply doesn't matter. I know a lot of the world building is built into the Cliff Notes, but it's a break in the action a lot of the time, and half the time it's not interesting or important at all. A lot of people say to just skip the footnotes, but I don't know how I can say I liked a book if I'm skipping half the book. The other thing that I really didn't like about Kristoff's writing style in this book was, oh my goodness, the flowery writing and the number of metaphors and similes that he used drove me nuts. And the repetitiveness of it. He couldn't even come up with new things. He just kept saying the same stuff over and over again. There was one character that showed up on the scene. It's essentially, his smile was like a fresh suicide. Beautiful right now, but rotting once it's been in the box for a while or something like that. Then every time that character would walk into the room, the narrative would refer to him as the boy with the suicide smile, and his suicide smile. First of all, it's a terrible simile. It's awful. Second of all, it barely makes sense. There's also a character that has a silverware smile, and every time you see that character, his silverware smile is referenced. That doesn't even make sense. What are you even saying, Jay Kristoff? I don't even think you know. I'm not really into extremely flowery writing anyway, but if you're gonna do flowery writing, at least make it make sense, man. Also, I thought Mia was a really cool character to start, but she very slowly became very generic and lost pretty much everything that made her interesting, in my opinion. There was only one character that I liked, and, well, by the end of the book, it wasn't gonna be worth continuing on just for the like of this one character. Nevernight let me down. A lot of people love it. I didn't. Next book, I'm sad to say, was A Wise Man's Fear. So The Name of the Wind made it onto my favorite books of the year list. And A Wise Man's Fear, it's not that I hate this book, it's just that it let me down. It was a disappointment. I loved book 1 so much, but I was really let down with book 2. Take away the weird fairy rape scene that went on for literally 70 pages. 70 pages, there were 70 of them. Take away all that, and even without that, I was just so bummed out by this. I didn't feel like the story progressed enough to justify this many pages. Sure, we got small, little progressions in the world and in the growth of Kvothe, but this is supposed to be 3 books, and at this point, not enough that's been promised has happened. I just don't see how we can cover the amount of years that we need to cover, kill a king, because this is called the Kingkiller Chronicles, and wrap up the many, many, many loose ends that we have. I don't see how we can do it in one more book. I hope Patrick Rothfuss proves me wrong. I hope that after I read book 3, I'll go back and read book 2 and change my rating and feel like it was more intentional than it was. But this book did not feel intentional enough to me. Book 1 felt like every word mattered. Book 2 didn't. I think he was still intentional in what he did with the different sequences, but it also felt like it was way more meandering than the first one, and it didn't feel like we progressed the story enough to be able to handle just one more book. If Rothfuss had 3 more books set up, then I could just call this middle book syndrome. He meandered, he dawdled, whatever, we'll wrap it up well. But since there's only one more promised, I don't see how we can do it well. I don't see how Rothfuss could keep his beautiful writing style and his beautiful storytelling and only do one more unless we're going to wheel it out of the bookstore with a wheelbarrow, which he's promised we won't. I do have a full review for this. If you want to check it out, I'll link it. Unfortunately, the next book that let me down is The Blinding Knife. The Black Prism was, I think I gave it 4.5 stars. Loved it. It was such a good setup for the series and I was so excited for where it was gonna go. And book 2, man, again, felt a lot less intentional, and also some of the things that happened in book 2 felt like, it's so hard to talk about a second book in a series without being spoilery. It just felt like a couple of things that happened in book 2 made me feel like, why did we do all these things if that thread is going to end like this? I have a whole review for this one too. Go check it out if you feel like it. Unfortunately, unlike the Kingkiller Chronicles, I don't feel excited for book 3 for this series. Book 1 I thought was so solid, but I still had my qualms with it. And book 2, it felt like it just leaned into the things I didn't like so much without giving me very much of the things that I did like. People seem pretty mixed on this series. Some people say, yeah, book 3 is even worse than book 2, but book 4, whew, it makes it worth it. And that's a tough one for me. It's hard for me to continue with the series knowing that the next book's gonna be even worse. But then a lot of people say that book 3 is great. So, you know, part of me wants to continue on with this series, but a lot of me doesn't have the motivation at the moment. I don't really know what I'm going to do with this one. And unfortunately, the last book that I'm going to quickly get through that bummed me out is The Shining. I've read a couple of King books this year, and generally I've enjoyed myself with him, but The Shining just didn't live up to what I thought it would. King is a writer that really focuses on his characters. King is a writer that uses horror as a tool to get to something bigger. In Pet Sematary, he explored grief. In The Shining, he explored alcoholism, as well as a couple of other things. I love that King uses horror as a tool to explore deeper topics. I think that it's brilliant, and I think he does it so well. Unfortunately, with his stories being so character-focused, you have to connect with the characters in order to like getting through the story. And I just didn't connect with these characters. Obviously that's a preference thing. Some people loved this, but I just couldn't care less about reading about Jack's backstory and about how he was managing the hotel and about his backstory with his writing. I didn't care. Also, unfortunately, I felt like there was a lot of character work in this with a little bit of horror, which I suppose you could say the same thing about Pet Sematary, which was on my favorites books of the year list. But with this one, since I didn't care for the character work, I felt like I was getting through so much boring stuff to get to the really great horror, and the horror was done so well in this book. And then I would get a little bit of that, and then we'd be back to the boring character stuff, and then a little bit of the horror and back to the boring character stuff. So again, this is very subjective, because if you connect with the characters, then you're gonna love this book. I just didn't, so I didn't connect with it. And now we finally get to talk about my 1-star book this year, and that was The Duke and I. So I am gonna talk in spoilers, so if this is a book that you have any interest in reading, I would recommend clicking away from this video now, because I'm gonna rant and I'm gonna use spoilers. The Duke and I is a historical romance, and romance already isn't my #1 genre. Sometimes I love a good romance and sometimes I don't. And because it's not a genre that I tend to read a lot of or tend to love a ton, I'm pretty picky about it, so I just don't pick it up that often. But one of my very good friends, it's her favorite genre, historical romances, and she really wanted me to get into it, so she sent me a couple of her favorites. So I'm going to start off this by saying we are good. I told her all my thoughts. She agreed, and she said, yeah, these are problems of the book, but it doesn't change her love for it, and I respect that, and I think that that's awesome. She respects my opinions. We're good. We're mature adults. Don't worry about it. But reading this book, I kind of thought that it was going to be, a 3-star, solid, middle of the road, you're all right, or even maybe a 4-star. Who knows, man? But let me tell you the reasons why it ended up being a 1. This is a story about 2 people, Daphne and Simon. They end up being in a relationship of circumstances. He wants to be less desirable and left alone by all the mothers who want to marry him off to their daughters, and so he decides to be in a fake relationship. She wants to be more desirable, and he convinces her that by being mildly taken, suddenly the guys are gonna want you. So they fake date. Here's why it sucked. First of all, Daphne. Daphne was a great character. She was really smart, witty, funny, she was so great. She was also really intuitive and smart. She had 4 brothers, and she knew about what guys thought about and what guys said and did, and she knew that Simon was a rake, which basically means a player. She knows that Simon and her brother went whoring around when they were off traveling abroad. She's smart, and pretty much anytime anybody tries to pull the wool over her, she knows, and she keeps repeating, I have 4 brothers. I know the way guys work. And she usually did. Until she didn't. And then, man, didn't she? On her wedding night, her mom decides to have the sex talk with her. Daphne is shocked that in order to have babies, you have to have sex. This is brand new information to her, and she is floored by it. She's also super surprised to find out that you can have sex just for fun. Once she found out that this is how you make babies, she thought, here, this is its purpose. You make babies this way. I want to be clear, this is not a product of the time. I've read a lot of classics, and women are not this in the dark about relationships. There is definitely an expectation about when sex comes into the relationship in classics, but women know how babies are made. And the way this scene was done was so over the top for her ignorance. Her ignorance served a purpose in this novel. Who did it? But don't worry, Daphne is not the only one that sucks here. The Duke sucks too. Simon sucks too. Simon ends up telling Daphne, hey, I can't have kids. And that's kind of how he tries to convince her that he can't marry her. He has strong feelings for her, but he refuses to marry her because he can't have kids, so he can't give her what she wants because she just wants to be a wife and a mother. She's bummed out by this, but she's in love with him and she wants to marry him, so she says, that sucks, but let's get married anyway. And because of a set of circumstances, they end up getting married. Because Daphne knows nothing about sex, the Duke and Daphne continue on with their relationship, and it's basically explained that the Duke pulls out when they have sex. She often thinks to herself, that's funny. Wonder why he does that. Oh well, guess this is how you have sex. Until somebody makes a comment, and then she realizes, hang on, this isn't normal. She puts 2 and 2 together and realizes the man is intentionally not getting her pregnant. She realizes that he lied to her. It's not that he can't have children, it's that he's choosing not to have children, and he's just been manipulating her this whole time. There's nothing wrong with not wanting to have kids. There is something wrong with lying to your spouse and taking advantage of their ignorance and making them have sex in a specific way because you feel like it. Simon takes advantage of Daphne's ignorance a lot. He does not communicate with her, and it's really bad the way he manipulates her throughout this book. But let's talk about Daphne some more, because somehow she manages to suck worse than the Duke. Simon. His name's Simon. Daphne is understandably mad. She's mad that he lied to her. She's mad that he hasn't been communicating to her why he doesn't want children, that he doesn't want children, that their whole relationship has been formed in a way that is manipulative. She doesn't like that he took advantage of her ignorance. This is all pretty understandable. They get into a big argument, he leaves, gets drunk, comes home, falls asleep next to her. She wakes up in the middle of the night, starts having sex with him, which then he wakes up and he's like, all right, cool, I'm down for this. But he's still drunk and she's on top of him, putting her in a position of leverage. So Daphne rapes him. Simon is enjoying the sex until he realizes, I have to pull out. But he's still drunk and he's not in a position of leverage, so he can't do it on his own. And he specifically, verbally, out loud says, Daphne, stop, I don't want. To which then she cuts him off by forcing herself on him and forcing him to finish inside of her. This is rape. He did not consent to this kind of sex. He physically said, no, stop, I don't want this, and she forced herself on him, taking advantage of his situation. They then get into a big fight. Simon starts stuttering because he has a stutter, and he stutters when he's emotional, and he storms out and goes on a trip. She specifically thinks to herself, did I take advantage of him? Yeah. Do I feel bad about it? no. This might be the only way I could get pregnant. I'm actually pretty happy by what I did. Never in this book is the word rape used, but it's very obvious that this is what happened. The final reason this book sucked is because of the lack of consequences for these horrible people's horrible behaviors. Daphne's late for her period. She feels great about that. She writes him a letter saying, "Haha, sucker, you're a daddy." That's not what she says, but you know, at this point, we elaborate. She says she's pregnant, sends him a letter. He receives the letter and decides to come home. When he comes home, he's mad at her for horseback riding, and he's like, "Hey, you're gonna lose the baby this way." And she's mad at him because she just had her period, and it turns out she was just late and not pregnant. They finally talk it out. He explains why he doesn't want children. She says his explanation is stupid. He decides maybe he kind of wants a baby, and she says, "I thought you were mad at me for what I did." He says, "I didn't like what you did. Please don't do that again." But that's not why I was mad. I was actually just mad because I started stuttering and I was embarrassed by my stutter, so I bailed. They then make up, he works through his issues, they have a baby, and live happily ever after. The word rape is never used. He's actually never even mad at her for raping him. She just gets over the way he treated her as well, and everything's fine. This isn't supposed to be a book with perfect people having perfect actions. These characters are supposed to be flawed, but it's also supposed to be romantic. And in my opinion, there was nothing romantic about this book at all. This was a book about abusive, selfish people who manipulated and lied to each other throughout the entire book, took advantage of each other, and did everything for the sake of their own agendas and gain. They were never on the same page. They never treated each other with any respect, and they were constantly abusing and taking advantage of one another. There was nothing romantic about this book at all, and yet it's a romance. I'm not gonna rate a book 1 star for just not being for me, and I'm not gonna rate a book 1 star because I didn't like the romance. But I will rate a book 1 star if it is romanticized abuse, and that's what this book was. There you go, you finally got my rant. So those were my least favorite books of the year. Some of them were just a disappointment. I'll probably still continue on with the series. It's not that big of a deal. Some of them, well, one of them, I hated. I'd love to hear what your least favorite books of the year were. I'd love to hear if you've read these books and what your thoughts on them were. I post videos every Sunday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. I'll see you guys again soon. Bye.